Hope you guys are doing all right. Uh, welcome, welcome. Thank you for showing up for another SAT prep course. Today we're going to be in SAT Practice Test 7, and I'm going to post the link in the chat where you can download that. And you don't want to download the PDF. If you just have your massive blue book, it's going to be on page 702 is the passage we'll be looking at. So very often, for the SAT reading comprehension section, you will get two samples of passages that have been written a long time ago. And they're usually expressing a very precise political opinion. And they usually, not always, but usually disagree at least slightly. Sometimes they disagree a lot, but they're always at least a little bit different from one another. And then it's your job to suss out kind of what those authors believe. It's not our job to suss out whether or not we agree with it. And that's important to know because a lot of times these passages choose issues which are very likely to just incite our opinions, right? Usually they're issues of either slavery or of women's rights. Those are the two sort of focuses that the historical passages tend to lean toward. And again, we in the 21st century, like we've got some very clear sort of opinions and views about that. But it's not our job to figure out who's right in these passages. It's our job to figure out what they're saying, how they would agree with each other, and how the passages might disagree with each other. Okay, so it should look something like this. I'm going to mute myself while I set up my my tablet here, and we'll dive in just a minute. All right, without further ado, let's get at it. So it's been a minute since we've looked at a double header passage, but if you don't have this written down anywhere, I would definitely recommend writing this down. If you take away nothing else from the strategies for the double header passages, it's this. Treat these passages like two separate reading tests. Treat these double header passages like two separate reading tests. That means we're going to follow all the same steps that we normally would on a reading comp, but we're going to do them all for passage 1, then all for passage 2, and then at the very end, we'll probably be asked some questions about both. That's generally how the questions are set up too, so it's actually not too difficult to navigate. These beginning questions are all going to be about passage 1. Then eventually we'll work into the passage 2 questions, and then eventually you see words like this, like both authors. We're being asked to combine our views and ask and basically like imagine how those two ideas might interact. Let's start on this first passage here. So with passage 1, what are we going to do first? First thing we're going to do is we're going to read the blurb. Now we're only going to read the blurb for passage 1. And we don't get a lot. It's adapted from Alexis de Tocqueville from Democracy in America, Volume 2, originally published in 1840. Okay, so we know when it was published and we know who it was published by. If you're studying Alexis de Tocqueville, you might know some of his opinions on things. You might not. But we've read the blurb. Check. What's next? Next, we want to sandwich the passage. So that's like reading the first and last sentences of a lot of these paragraphs. And it doesn't have to be the first and the exact last sentence of every one. This isn't a formula. This is just more of a tool to gain understanding of the flow of this passage. So we start out here. I have shown how democracy destroys or modifies the different inequalities which originate in society. But is this all? Okay, well, it looks like he's moving from one topic into another. In fact, that would probably incite me to keep reading. Or does it not ultimately affect the great inequality of man and woman, which has seemed up to the present day to be eternally based in human nature? Okay, that gives me a pretty good idea of the main idea. Let's see if he keeps talking about gender here. For there is no subject on which the coarse and lawless fancies of our age have taken a freer range. Well, assuming he's still talking about this, he thinks people are thinking maybe a little too freely about these ideas. And lo and behold, yes, next sentence. There are people in Europe who, confounding together the different characteristics of the sexes, would make of man and woman beings not only equal, but alike. Okay, so here he is talking about other people's views of gender in Europe. And from so preposterous a medley of the works of nature, nothing could ever result but weak men and disorderly women. All right, well, he has some very clear ideas of where those ideas and mindsets will lead to. Let's follow it through. It is not thus that the Americans understand that species of democratic equality which may be established between the sexes. Okay, so now he's talking about the opinions of Americans. Which makes sense if this essay is all about, democracy in America. Let's see these last two sentences here. The Americans have applied to the sexes the great principle of political economy, which governs the manufacturers of our age by carefully dividing the duties of man from those of woman in order that the great work of society may be better carried on. Okay, so Alexis de Tocqueville seems to think that America, in 1840 anyway, is doing it right, and that men and women should have different jobs, should have different tasks. Now, again, we might feel a way about this, right? It's just like, oh, it's not our job. For the sake of the SAT, it's not our job to figure out whether Alexis de Tocqueville is right or wrong. It's our job to most fully understand the idea he's putting forward. It's a good skill in life, honestly, to understand what someone's saying without worrying about whether we agree with them or not. At least initially, and certainly on the SAT. So we've read our blurb, we've sandwiched our passage, we have a little bit of idea of where good old Alexi is coming from. Now we're going to do the helicopter view of the questions, right? So we're going to try and categorize these questions in terms of whether they are vocab. Hopefully you have all these memorized by now. If you don't, write them down. Whether they are vocab and context questions, line questions, graph or data interpretation questions, or broad questions. I don't think we're going to get a lot of graphs or data for Alexis de Tocqueville, but I do think that vocab, lines, and broad are all going to be present here. But again, remember, we're treating this like it's its own test. So we're not even worrying about any of the questions that have to do with passage 2, certainly not worrying about the questions that have to do with both, because that would explode our brains for right now. So 32, as used in line 9, raise most nearly means, okay, well that is clearly a vocab in context question. And on test day, yeah, on test day, I would mark that with a V and come back to it probably first, because I can answer it with very little context. In passage 1, Tocqueville implies, number 33, that treatment of men and women as identical in nature would have which consequence? Well, we got a little bit of an idea of the consequences there. The issue there is, though, that this seems to be a broad question until we scroll down or turn our eyes down on test day, and we see that it's actually connected to number 34. Lo and behold, this is a line question. I'm going to answer it after I answer the vocab and context. Number 35, as used in line 53, dominion most nearly means. Yep, that's another vocab and context. Nothing to write home about there. Number 36, in passage 2. Whoa, we don't care. It's passage 2. We're not even looking at it yet. All right, so we just have these 4 questions to worry about for right now. So let's start at the top. In line 9, raise most nearly means. There it is. So let's read the whole sentence for context. I believe that the social changes which bring nearer the same level the father and son, the master and servant, and superiors and inferiors, generally speaking, will raise woman and make her more and more the equal of man. Okay, so he's talking about what you might call upward mobility. He's not talking about woman being physically raised, like no one's getting hoisted into the air here. He's talking about her position kind of on the social ladder and in terms of societal power. So again, what I like to do is just cross this out and think what other words might work there to make her more and more the equal of man. We could talk about empowering. We could talk about elevating. Again, it's not raise in the literal sense, and it's not raise in like, oh, these are my parents, they raised me, right? You see how we have these metaphors in our language? Like we're talking about physical ups and downs, but we're not actually talking about ups and downs. We're talking about ups and downs in terms of power. So which one comes the closest in our synonyms to empowering? Increase. Well, no, that would be like if you raise prices, you might increase prices, but we're not increasing women. There's not going to be more of them. Cultivate. Well, cultivate is more of a gardening metaphor. That would just mean to, not necessarily to make someone more powerful, but certainly to make them better. I don't know if that's right. Nurture. Again, nurture is the kind of raise that I was talking about earlier, like where you raise a child. But we're not talking about, raising woman in that way. We're talking about a population of adults. So they don't need to be raised in that way. But they could be elevated in their power structure. That's why I like 32. You see how all of these can serve as synonyms for raise in other contexts? That's why the context is so important. To drive that point home, let's look at number 35. Knock out all of our vocab and context right away. As used in line 53, dominion most nearly means. Okay. Oh my word, line 53 is in passage 2. We don't even need to worry about that. We literally only have 3 passage 1 questions to worry about. So let's dive into this one. In passage 1, Tocqueville implies that treatment of men and women as identical in nature would have which consequence? All right, so let's find our key words here. Consequence seems like an important word. Treatment. And yeah, we know we have to be focused on gender somehow. Identical in nature. also seems important. So at this point, we're sort of making synonyms. We're making our own versions of the words that we see. So the treatment of men and women as identical. Well, men and women, we might see something about genders. We might see something about the sexes. Identical, we could probably see like equal, alike, maybe even just like similar, if we don't want to get like so precise. Consequence, that's more of a negative connotation, but some synonyms for consequence might include result, right? Anything that's talking about the results of the treatment of the genders as equal or identical, it's going to have a certain result. So now we have to find, we know that our answer has its evidence somewhere in these lines. And we know that these lines have to have something to do with these key words. So we're going to do what we normally do and solve them backwards. We're going to go through number 34 and see which of the choices line up with the context established in 33. So starting off with lines 15 to 18, there and ending with alike. We already read this. There are people in Europe who, confounding together the different characteristics of the sexes, would make of man and woman beings not only equal, but alike. I think that one gets us halfway there. We're talking about the treatment of men and women as alike, as equal, like that seems to line up, but we're not talking at all about the consequences of that. We're not talking about the result. So I don't think that A is going to get us there. Tempting, but no. Lines 18 to 20, starting with they and ending with rights. They would give to both the same functions, impose on both the same duties, and grant to both the same rights. Therefore what? Like, so what? De Tocqueville, what will happen then? We don't have any results, right? Again, he's still talking about what other people think in Europe, but he's not talking about what that will result in. He's not talking about consequences yet. Let's look at lines 22 to 24. Starting with it may and ending with degraded. It may readily be conceived that by thus attempting to make one sex equal to the other, both are degraded. All right, now that is a promising answer. That one says, when you do this, this happens. If one sex is made equal to the other, both are degraded. I like C best so far. For the sake of fullest understanding, let's look at lines 27 to 29. Starting with it is, ending with sexes. It is not thus that the Americans understand that species of democratic equality which may be established between the sexes. Okay, well now, again, he's just back to talking about other people's opinions. He's back to talking about Americans versus Europeans. He's not talking about consequences. So it seems that C is our strongest answer, this passage right here. So we need to ask then, what is this saying? It may readily be conceived. So conceived meaning like thought of, like you have a concept, you have a conception of that thought. It may readily be conceived that by thus attempting to make one sex equal to the other, okay, so that's the action that we're looking for a consequence of, both are degraded. Well, what does it mean to degrade something? Well, it mostly means that we've lessened it, right? In the same way that, you know, we use the word grade to talk about quality. You might buy your eggs and they are grade A eggs, yeah? You might be hoping to get a good grade in your class. That's what you're being graded on. To be degraded would mean to lessen the quality. So de Tocqueville is saying that, like, if we make men and women equal, then that makes both of them worse. So we have a pretty good idea of what de Tocqueville is saying, I think. But let's go ahead and choose option C as our answer. Cross out D. All right, so which of these most lines up with what we've read? Neither sex would feel oppressed. Well, no, I don't see that there at all. Both sexes would be greatly harmed. Yeah, that's close. Let's keep going. Men would try to reclaim their lost authority. I don't see that. I don't see that in that line. There's nothing about what men would do. It would just make both of them worse. Men and women would have privileges they do not need. I mean, maybe that's what he means, but he doesn't say it there. So really, B is our best answer. They're both going to be degraded, according to de Tocqueville. Okay, and with that, we've finished our questions of passage 1 for now. We haven't read the whole passage, but we have a pretty good idea of what Alexis de Tocqueville thinks about gender equality. Now we're going to move on to passage 2. And if passage 1 was about gender equality, there's a good chance that passage 2 will be as well, from a slightly different perspective. Or maybe not so slight. We'll figure it out. Let's read the blurb. Passage 2. Well, we've got a lot more information on passage 2 than passage 1. Passage 2 is adapted from Harriet Taylor Mill, Enfranchisement of Women, originally published in 1851, so 11 years later. As United States and European societies grew increasingly democratic during the 19th century, debates arose about whether freedoms enjoyed by men should be extended to women as well. So that part of the blurb does actually seem to apply to both passages. We saw a lot of those themes. Pardon me. Rest in peace, anyone wearing headphones. Sorry about that. So we saw those themes working in Alexis de Tocqueville, right? We saw him sort of just talking about the increased, we know he's talking about democracy in America, talking about democracy in Europe, and it seems that all things are being made equal. And so the question is now being asked, should so gender? Should things be made equal between the sexes? Alexis de Tocqueville had one very specific opinion about that. Let's see what Harriet Taylor Mill says. Any clues in here? Well, she says enfranchisement of women. You probably haven't heard the word enfranchisement much. You might be familiar with its antonym, disenfranchisement. If a population feels disenfranchised, that means they're being depowered and kept powerless by other groups. So Harriet Taylor Mill has titled hers The Enfranchisement of Women. Well, let's see where it goes. We've read our blurb. Let's start sandwiching. Passage 2. As society was constituted until the last few generations, inequality was its very basis. Well, okay. Starting off some very strong words. What do we have at the bottom here? So the problem with these historical passages is that once they start a sentence, they don't know how to end it. But of all relations, that between men and women being the nearest and most intimate and connected with the greatest number of strong emotions was sure to be the last to throw off the old rule and receive the new. For, in proportion to the strength of a feeling is the tenacity with which it clings to the forms and circumstances with which it has even accidentally become associated. All right, so we're talking about men and women. We're talking about how it's linked. These relationships are linked to strong emotions, and therefore they're resistant to change. The last to throw off the old rule and receive the new. And then she kind of makes this statement that I read really quickly, so it might have been hard to follow, but essentially just saying that, in proportion to the strength of a feeling, if you feel more strongly about a tradition, that tradition is going to stay on for longer. That's essentially it. The relationships between men and women are a hot emotional button, and therefore those traditions are going to be hard to change. The proper sphere for all human beings is the largest and highest which they are able to attain to. Okay, we'll probably get a better idea of what she's saying there later. And again, this is a long, long paragraph. But where do we end this sentence? See what I mean? If you were to write something like this, if you were to write something like this in your English class, you would be accused of writing a run-on. But to interfere beforehand by an arbitrary limit and declare that whatever be the genius, talent, energy, or force of mind of an individual of a certain sex or class, these faculties shall not be exerted, or shall be exerted only in some few of the many modes in which others are permitted to use theirs, it is not only an injustice to the individual and a detriment to society, which loses what it can ill spare, but it is also the most effectual way of providing that in the sex or class so fettered, the qualities which are not permitted to be exercised shall not exist. All right, well, again, we haven't read all of that. Harriet Taylor Mill seemed to pack a lot more and a lot fewer words, so I can understand why she wouldn't want to end that sentence. She's really building up steam there. But let's look at the questions here and see if that better frames our understanding of what this author is saying. Now, we only have two passage 2 questions, 36 and 37. This first one looks broad. Mill most strongly suggests that gender roles are resistant to change because they, however, 37, linked to it. So we're going to go through our usual topsy-turvy backwards question answering method. And we are going to start, sorry, I need to minimize this. Yes, here we go. All right, so same exact thing as we did in number 33 and 34 over here, right? We'll look for our keywords. Mill most strongly suggests that gender roles, so this has to be about gender, which most of it is, are resistant to change because, okay, so gender roles being resistant to change. Well, again, we know some synonyms for gender used in that era. We might talk about the sexes, we might just talk about men and women, and we know that they're resistant to change. So think of some synonyms of resistant to change. You might think like stubborn or immovable, right? Something that just seems fixed in its ways. So why are these roles resistant to change? Well, let's look at the evidence provided in the passage. Lines 43 to 44, starting with as society and ending with basis. We read this already. As society was constituted until the last few generations, inequality was its very basis. That has to do with general inequality, doesn't really have to do with gender roles, doesn't really have to do with resistance to change. So I don't really like A. It's hard with passages like this because, when you have such a short amount of time to make a point, everything's kind of connected. But we want to look for the clearest connections to these ideas: gender roles and resistance to change. Lines 46 to 49, starting with to, ending with other. Two persons could hardly cooperate in anything or meet in any amicable relation without the laws appointing that one of them should be the superior of the other. Well, that seems to just sort of restate what's going on here, right? Inequality is a long historical tradition, kind of the basis of society until recently, is what Mill is saying here. But it doesn't have to do with gender roles specifically, and it doesn't have to do, again, with resistance to change. So let's look at 58 to 61, starting with in proportion and ending with associated. In proportion to the strength of a feeling is the tenacity with which it clings to the forms and circumstances with which it has even accidentally become associated. Okay, now that might not seem linked to gender roles right away, but if we look at the full context of this sentence, remember we've read this already, we read that the relationships between men and women are the nearest and most intimate and connected with the greatest number of strong emotions. So, like premise A, she says men and women's relationships are filled with strong emotions, and therefore they are sure to be the last to throw off the old rule. In other words, the last to change and receive the new. That's when she goes on to say, in proportion to the strength of the feeling, the more strongly you feel about something, the tenacity with which it clings to the forms and the circumstances, the stronger you're going to hold to what you're already familiar with. So C seems the strongest connection so far. Let's see if 67 to 69 hits it on the nose even more. Starting with employments and ending with them. Employments will fall into the hands of those men or women who are found by experience to be most capable of worthily exercising them. Okay, well, she's talking about, if we look at the whole sentence, let every occupation be open to all, without favor or discouragement to any. So she's talking about how, places of employment should employ people based on what they can do, not based on what their genders are. Now, that does have to do with gender roles, but it doesn't have to do with resistance to change. 56 to 61 seemed like a long shot, but when we look at it in context, it's actually the most closely associated. And we've gone over what this part of the passage is saying, right? Strong feelings equals hard to change structures. So let's see which of our answers lines up with what we already know. Are they resistant to change because they, A, have long served as the basis for the formal organization of society? Well, she says that about inequality in general, but it doesn't really come up in passage C. So I won't cross it out right away, but I'm wondering if we can't find something better. B, are matters of deeply entrenched tradition. Well, yeah, we definitely see that evidence there, right? We see them tied in with strong emotion and therefore strong tradition. So I like B better than A. C, can be influenced by legislative reforms only indirectly. No, I don't see anything about the law. We're all talking about emotion and tradition. D, benefit the groups and institutions currently in power. Well, again, that might make sense, but do we see it in the passage? We're talking about the strength of a feeling and forms and circumstances. Yeah, we're talking about traditions here. We're not talking about laws. We're not even really talking about institutions as much as we mean individuals. So that's where I would bring this. Again, you see the importance of pulling yourself out of these passages as much as possible. You might see how an idea makes sense or how an idea could be linked, but this isn't a history test and this isn't a politics test. This is a reading test. We're being asked, not if the ideas make sense to you or if you would connect those ideas, but does Mill connect those ideas? Does Tocqueville connect those ideas? That's what we're interested for the sake of the reading comprehension. Now we're going to move into the ones that I call the mega broad questions, the ones that just have to do with both passages at once. And we've got a tizzy of them right here. So hopefully I've done this already. But if you remember, the double header passages are like a Venn diagram. We have passage 1 over here. We have passage 2 over here. I don't know if you can hear that, but someone is honking their horn really loudly. They're mad because their SAT scores were too low. That's what it is. It's okay. It's all right. We offer individual tutoring. Oh, yeah, he quieted down. See, he's fine. So we have passage 1 and passage 2, right? Tocqueville and Mill. And again, we're not being asked what we think. We're being asked, what would Tocqueville say about Mill? What would Mill say about Tocqueville? And where might the two overlap in their own opinions? And that's what we're being asked about right now. We're being asked about the overlap. Both authors would most likely agree that the changes in gender roles that they describe would be what? Well, we have a pretty good idea of what both of these authors want about gender equality, right? De Tocqueville seems to think that certain kinds of gender equality would lead to the degradation of both genders if we were to treat them as alike. Whereas Mill, Harriet Taylor Mill, seems to think that we should be basing our occupations and our societies not based on gender, but based on ability. Now, what would they agree on, though? Let's see. Now, if I see anything that appears in Tocqueville but doesn't appear in Mill, I'm not interested in it. I'm only interested in the stuff that fits in both. So if it comes up in one but not in the other, it's not for us. So A, part of a broad social shift toward greater equality. Well, they definitely do seem to think that these are linked to, to larger social movements. Um, de Tocqueville talks about those movements in Europe and those movements in America. And in passage 2, if we read between our lines here, we see Mill saying, mankind has outgrown this state. Which state? This state of inequality as its basis. Now, they may disagree about whether or not that's a good thing, but they do both seem to think that it's linked to the same kind of social movements. Let's see if there's something else that's more on the nose. B, unlikely to provide benefits that outweigh their costs. Well, Tocqueville might think that, but I don't think Mill would think that. C, inevitable given the economic advantages of gender equality. I mean, Mill talked a bit about those economic advantages, but I don't think de Tocqueville really brings it up at all. He just talks about how it would make both genders worse. D, at odds with the principles of American democracy. Well, no, I think de Tocqueville talks about American democracy. Mill doesn't really bring it up at all. Yeah, I don't see that in here at all for Mill. So again, that's in one circle, but not the other. So I cross out D. A is a little sticky because, right, we naturally assume greater equality equals better. And de Tocqueville doesn't seem to think that this would be better, but he does see that it's part of a broader social shift. Even though he might not agree about whether that equality is a good thing, he does see society moving toward equality. So A is our best bet for now. '39. Tocqueville, in passage 1, would most likely characterize the position taken by Mill in lines 65 to 69 in passage 2, starting with let and ending in them, as, okay, so this is an instance where we're being given something that Mill says, right? I don't even know what I was doing there. Exclamation point, there we go. Something that Mill says. What do we think Tocqueville would say to Mill's opinion? Let's check it out. So we're being asked to look at lines 65 to 69, starting with let and ending with them. Let every occupation be open to all, without favor or discouragement to any, and employments will fall into the hands of those men or women who are found by experience to be most capable of worthily exercising them. So we've looked at this passage already, right? Occupation should be open, not based on gender, but based on ability, based on experience, right? So what do we think de Tocqueville would have to say about this? Well, he probably wouldn't agree with it, right? He might say that this is part of the degradation. If we look back at what he said about American democracy over here, applied to the sexes, the great principle of political economy, which governs the manufactures of our age, by carefully dividing the duties of man from those of woman, in order that the great work of society may be better carried on. So he would definitely believe in gender segregation of occupation, not based on ability, but based on gender. So what would Tocqueville have to say about Mill here? Would he say A, that this position is less radical about gender roles than it might initially seem? No, he's not all that nuanced about it. I don't think he's like looking at a position and saying like, ah, well, this position seems one way, but it's actually another. Um, B, is he persuasive? Does he think it's persuasive in the abstract, but difficult to implement in practice? Actually, de Tocqueville doesn't talk much about practice. He is mostly talking about the abstract of just like the degradation of both genders. It's like, okay, what does that mean? Like on a day-to-day level? He doesn't really get into it. He does talk about, what does he say, weak men and disorderly women. But again, I don't think he would agree with Mill's idea in the abstract or on the practical level. So I'd cross out B as well. C, ill-advised, so he disagrees with it, but consistent with a view held by some other advocates of gender equality. So would he say like, yeah, this isn't what I believe, but it is what others believe? That seems like a pretty strong argument, especially when you consider how much time he talks about what others believe. Right? Here we go. They would give, they meaning the European egalitarians, they would give to both genders the same functions, impose on both the same duties, and grant to both the same rights. Yeah, that seems pretty consistent with option C. He's saying it's not for me, but that is what some people in Europe are doing. Let's see if D is any better. D, compatible with economic progress in the United States, but not in Europe. Well, no, what he had to say about the United States was kind of pro-gender segregation. He's saying the US is doing a good job of splitting up the duties of men and women. So C is definitely our best bet. You see how this gets a little noodly? It gets a little hard to figure out exactly what these writers are saying, because we're very used to looking at these issues in black and white and very quick to form our own opinions without first understanding the opinions of this writer in this time. So number 40 asks, which choice best describes the ways that the two authors conceive of the individual's proper position in society? Oh, okay, so are we asking about the overlap? Are we asking about how the two agree? Well, you might think so at first, but no, you see all these options have Tocqueville thinks this, Mill believes this, right? So let's check these out. A, Tocqueville believes that an individual's position should be defined in important ways by that individual's sex, while Mill believes that an individual's abilities should be the determining factor. Well, that lines up with what we've read so far. Not gender primarily, but ability. Can they do the work? Let's see if we find anything better. B, Tocqueville believes that an individual's economic class should determine an individual's position, while Mill believes that class is not a legitimate consideration. Well, no, Tocqueville doesn't seem particularly focused on class, and he doesn't even seem all that classist. It's more the gender that he takes issue with. C, Tocqueville believes that an individual's temperament should determine that individual's position. So what's their emotional state? How are they feeling? While Mill believes that temperament should not be a factor. No, I don't think emotion's the primary concern here. D, Tocqueville believes that an individual's position should be determined by what is most beneficial to society, while Mill believes that it should be determined by what an individual finds most rewarding. Well, that certainly sounds like two interesting essays, but I don't think it's the essays that we just read. Both of them seem to think that what they're saying is what's most beneficial to society. We've seen that in Tocqueville, right? He wants the great work of society to be better carried on. And we see that in Mill. That's a detriment to society to cut people out based on their gender. So yeah, neither are anti-society. They just have different ideas about what the best way to go about doing society's work is. So that would bring us to A. Tocqueville thinks gender. Mill says no, it should mostly be ability. Okay, we're almost at the end here. So based on passage 2, that is Mill's passage, Mill would most likely say that the application of the great principle of political economy in lines 38 and 39 of passage 1 to gender roles has which effect? All right, so now we're going in the opposite way, as in number 39, right? Now, de Tocqueville's saying something. What do we think? What do we think Mill would have to say about de Tocqueville's opinion? Not what would we say, but what do we think Mill would say? Well, first we got to look at the context. We got to look at what de Tocqueville's opinion even is. I feel bad if anyone like just joined the meeting. I feel like I've set up this really complicated sports play. But that probably shows how much I know about football more than anything else. This doesn't look like sports at all. Let's look at what de Tocqueville has to say. Starting with, yes, 38 to 39, the great principle of political economy. The Americans have applied to the sexes the great principle of political economy, which governs the manufactures of our age by carefully dividing the duties of man from those of woman in order that the great work of society may be better carried on. Political economy. So this seems to be like specialization, right? If we think about industry, and people on an assembly line, like there's no person on an assembly line who's like assembling toothpaste tubes all the way through. We've got one person who's really good at screwing on the caps, right? That's their specialty. And de Tocqueville is saying that this same sort of specialization that should be applied to gender. Now, I don't actually know historically how this lines up with the invention of the assembly line. This definitely comes a lot before. But he's saying like, hey, you've got a job, do it. And like the ability for that job, like it's determined by gender. Not just by ability, but by the sex. So applying this to gender roles has which effect, according to Mill? A, it prevents many men and women from developing to their full potential. Well, Mill does seem very concerned about full potential, right? While de Tocqueville thinks that equality would lead to the degradation of both genders, Mill seems to have the opposite opinion. She wants all human beings to aspire to the largest and highest sphere which they're able to attain. Basically, do everything you can. Don't let your gender tell you what you can do. So that seems to line up pretty well. She's very interested in full potential. But let's keep looking. B, It makes it difficult for men and women to sympathize with each other. Well, no, while she talks about strong emotion, I don't see any emphasis on sympathy in passage 2. C, it unintentionally furthers the cause of gender equality. Is that what we think Mill would say? Like we apply this political term and it's like, oh no, de Tocqueville, this actually furthers gender equality. Joke's on you. No, I think Mill sees this as a real threat to gender equality. D, it guarantees that women take occupations that men are better suited to perform. Well, that seems more like something de Tocqueville would be concerned about, right? Like, don't send a woman in to do a man's job. That seems a lot more like something de Tocqueville would say. Not Mill. Mill is most interested in full potential. And just like that, we're done. Now, did it take me an hour? Yes, it took me an hour, but that's because, and I'll say it again, that's because I was explaining it out loud as I went. Using these same strategies, it would take me a lot less time. And if you implement these strategies, you're not going to waste all that time, trying to figure out like exactly what Mill is saying by these run-on sentences, or exactly what de Tocqueville is getting at through a sort of convoluted phraseology. You're going to use the passage to answer the questions. That's what you're supposed to do. The passages are interesting, and if you find something interesting that you're like, I'll read this in my free time sometime, do it. Absolutely. But on test day, all we're interested in is how can this get me the answers I need?
Okay, so thanks for watching, and please remember to contact us at info@embracetutoring.com to set up any personalized private tutoring sessions you would like. Stay tuned for future videos, and best of luck with your studies. We definitely encourage you to visit our Instagram as well as TikTok pages if you have any questions along the way. Take care, guys. Best of luck with your studies.